On August 15, 2025, Air Force One was heading toward Anchorage, Alaska, where Donald Trump was due to meet Vladimir Putin. It was to be the first summit between the American and Russian presidents since the outbreak of the full-scale war in Ukraine. But before Air Force One landed, and before Trump shook Vladimirovich Putin's hand, the American president made a call no one had expected. Trump phoned Minsk and spoke with Alexander Lukashenko, whom he described as a, quote, highly respected president. For Europeans, the conversation came as a shock. Western countries had refused to recognize the results of Belarus' rigged 2020 election, and as a consequence no longer regarded Lukashenko as the country's legitimate president. Trump was now breaking through that Western cordon sanitaire. It soon became clear that the call had not been an isolated gesture. Just 1 month later, the United States began gradually lifting sanctions on Belarus. First on the national airline Belavia, then on the potash sector, one of Lukashenko's main sources of foreign currency, and finally on the finance ministry and state-owned banks. Trump also appointed a special envoy for Belarus, John Cole, who now travels regularly between Washington and Minsk, negotiating the release of political prisoners from Belarusian penal colonies. These efforts help secure the freedom of several prominent detainees, including Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aleś Bialiatski and Andrzej Poczobut, an opposition activist from Belarus's Polish minority. The past few months have been thus extraordinarily intense for Aleksander Grigorievich, the former State Farm director who has ruled Belarus with an iron fist for more than 3 decades. At the very moment the United States is easing sanctions, Belarus's military dependence on Russia is greater than ever. Moscow is using Belarusian territory as a rear base for its war against Ukraine, integrating the country's military systems and incorporating Belarus into Russia's nuclear strategy. At the same time, Kyiv is warning ever more openly that continued support for Russian aggression could trigger Ukrainian strikes against targets on the Belarusian side of the border. Lukashenko has thus found himself caught between Russian demands, Ukrainian threats, and an unexpected opening from the United States. The situation surrounding Belarus raises a host of questions. Above all, what is the Trump administration really trying to achieve? Is the goal to prise Belarus from Vladimir Putin's iron grip, or are Washington's ambitions far more limited? What is Alexander Lukashenko's position today? Is he still an independent player, or has he already been reduced to the role of a governor who merely carries out orders from Moscow? These are the questions and many more that we'll try to answer in today's episode. Trump calls Lukashenko and refers to him as a highly respected president. The United States begins lifting sanctions on Belarus, while Moscow simultaneously pulls Minsk deeper into its war strategy. Lukashenko is playing on several fronts at once, and every one of those moves reshapes the balance of power in Central and Eastern Europe. Shifts like this have a way of catching people off guard, which is exactly why it can be beneficial to act deliberately rather than react after the fact. I have been doing that for years with XTB, the partner of this channel, and the place where I manage my own investments. The platform gives me access to over 11,600 instruments from around the world and the latest market news and expert analysis, all in one convenient app. That means I'm not just following the market, I'm responding to events as they unfold, not waiting for the media to catch up. Just remember that every investment carries risk. To understand Belarus's current predicament, we need to go back to the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, when independent states began emerging from the ruins of the communist colossus. Belarus was a unique case. Unlike Ukraine or the Baltic states, it had neither a strong tradition of statehood nor a deeply rooted national identity making it harder to break with Moscow and, quote, march west. Economic realities reinforced this dependence. The Belarusian economy relied almost entirely on Russia, on cheap Russian resources and access to the Russian market. The statistics tell the story. At the moment of independence, Russia accounted for more than 80% of Belarus's foreign trade. It is hardly surprising then that the difficult beginnings of independence and the deep economic crisis of the 1990s left many Belarusians profoundly disillusioned and revived nostalgia for the Soviet era. It was precisely this political climate that paved Alexander Lukashenko's way to the presidency in 1994. Lukashenko won 80% of the vote in the second round, campaigning on promises to fight corruption and restore Soviet-style, quote, order. Alexander Grigorievich offered his compatriots a distinctive social contract. Quote, stability became the central theme of his rule. As befitted a former director of a sovkhoz, a state-owned collective farm, Lukashenko cast himself as a capable manager, but also as a father, a guardian of the entire nation. Hence his popular nickname, Baćka, or father. Lukashenko presided over the re-Sovietation of Belarus, both politically and economically. After the 1994 election, Baćka quickly crushed the opposition and established authoritarian rule, earning the title of, quote, Europe's last dictator. In exchange for abandoning any dream of democracy, Lukashenko offered his people economic stability. Market reforms were reversed, central planning was restored, and Belarus rebuilt close economic ties with Russia, much as it had during the Soviet era. Though economically the model was inherently unsustainable. It could function only because Belarus had access to Russian oil and gas at preferential prices, the Russian consumer market, and loans from Moscow. The rapprochement between Minsk and Moscow advanced rapidly. As early as 1995, Alexander Lukashenko and Boris Yeltsin gave it a formal legal framework by signing a customs union treaty and an agreement on friendship, good neighborly relations, and cooperation. These agreements laid the foundation for the 1997 treaty establishing the Union of Belarus and Russia. The process culminated in the 1999 treaty creating the Union State of Belarus and Russia, an agreement that envisaged merging the two countries into a single political entity. At first, Lukashenko embraced the project with genuine enthusiasm. With Boris Yeltsin growing weaker, he hoped that he himself might eventually emerge as the leader of the Union State. Those grand political ambitions were buried in 2000, however, when Vladimir Putin became president of Russia. In Putin's hands, the Union State and Belarus's dependence on cheap Russian energy became tools for pressuring Minsk and gradually eroding Belarusian sovereignty. In 2002, Putin proposed incorporating Belarus into the Russian Federation as 6 new regions. For Lukashenko, that would obviously have meant the end of his rule. Over the following years, he therefore pursued a policy toward Russia that Dr. Adam Eberhard, the long-serving director of Center for Eastern Studies, described as a, quote, game of appearances. Lukashenko professed loyalty to the idea of unification and signed successive agreements on closer integration while consistently avoiding implementation of any provisions that would actually strip him of power. Crucially, Lukashenko never openly challenged Putin or questioned his own client status toward Russia. At the same time, however, he tried to resist Moscow's attempts to bring Belarus under its complete control. In this game of appearances, Lukashenko made skillful use of the Western card. Whenever relations with Moscow deteriorated, Minsk would improve ties with the European Union and the United States and release political prisoners, receiving an easing of Western sanctions in return. In this way, Lukashenko signaled to Putin that he had alternative partners and was not intimidated by Russian pressure. Minsk also deliberately distanced itself from some of Moscow's more controversial decisions. One example was the annexation of Crimea, which Belarus never formally recognized. Lukashenko also tried to strengthen his position by acting as a mediator. It was in Minsk that two agreements intended to end the war in the Donbas were signed in 2014 and 2015. For a long time, this game of appearances gave Lukashenko exactly what he wanted. Belarus was not absorbed, he remained in power, and Russian subsidies kept the Belarusian economy afloat. Between 1994 and 2020, Russia provided an estimated $35 billion in loans alone, not counting hidden subsidies on energy and raw materials. Everything changed with the 2020 presidential election. Like the elections before it, it was rigged by Lukashenko. This time, however, the fraud triggered mass protests, the largest in the history of independent Belarus. They continued for several months and could be suppressed only through extraordinary brutality by the security forces. This time the West not only imposed its customary sanctions on Minsk, but also refused to recognize the election result, denying Lukashenko the status of Belarus's legitimate president. The 2020 protests also marked a turning point in Belarusian-Russian relations. Lukashenko's international isolation meant that he could no longer play the game of appearances that had kept him in power for decades. After 2020, the Kremlin became the sole guarantor of his regime's survival, and it exploited that position fully. A year after the fraudulent election, Russia imposed on Minsk a package of 28 integration programs, along with a new military doctrine for the Union State of Belarus and Russia. Together they redefined that relationship and made Lukashenko even more dependent on the Kremlin. The old game of appearances came to a definitive end on February 24, 2022, with the invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces used Belarusian territory to launch their main assault on Kyiv. Aircraft and missiles took off from Belarus. Troops and equipment moved through the country by rail, and Belarusian airfields, military bases, and hospitals became part of Russia's wartime infrastructure. The West responded with sanctions not only against Moscow but also against Minsk, pushing Lukashenko into even deeper dependence on the Kremlin. Belarus's role in the aggression against Ukraine is a good point at which to ask what position Lukashenko occupies today. Can he still be described as an independent player, or has he already been reduced to the role of a Russian governor? Perhaps the best way to understand this problem comes from Katya Glod, an analyst at the New Eurasian Strategy Center, who describes Belarus as a state with, quote, uneven sovereignty. In domestic politics, Lukashenko's position remains very strong, thanks to his control over the state apparatus and the security services. Despite closer cooperation with Russian intelligence and security agencies in recent years, Belarus's coercive institutions remain loyal to Lukashenko. It is precisely the loyalty of the army, the police, and the KGB that allows him to continue ruling the country and to negotiate with Putin rather than merely carry out orders from the Kremlin. The picture is entirely different in foreign policy, the economy, and the national security. These areas are largely beyond Lukashenko's control. It is in this sense that Belarus has become a Russian client state. Moscow does not control every decision made in Minsk, but it defines the boundaries within which those decisions can be made. Put differently, Lukashenko has retained tactical autonomy but lost strategic autonomy. The fact that Vladimir Putin is now the ultimate master of the situation in Belarus is perhaps best illustrated by the Union State Security Guarantees Treaty signed in 2024. It provides for mutual assistance by all available means, not only in the event of external aggression, but also when sovereignty of the, quote, constitutional order is threatened. In practice, the treaty provides a legal basis for Russian intervention in Belarus should the mass protests of 2020 be repeated, or should a succession crisis emerge after Lukashenko's death. In short, Belarusian sovereignty has been sharply curtailed in recent years. but it would still be wrong to describe Lukashenko as merely Russia's governor in Minsk. The most accurate term is vassal, a ruler who remains an independent actor in certain areas, but whose room to maneuver has narrowed dramatically. Why has Moscow pushed so relentlessly for deeper integration with Belarus? Is this simply Vladimir Putin's obsession with rebuilding the Soviet Union, or is there more to it? Belarus matters to Russia above all because of geography. Its territory shields the so-called Smolensk Gate, the corridor between the upper reaches of the Daugava and Dnieper rivers that offers the most direct route toward Moscow. Control of Belarus pushes any potential frontline several hundred kilometers westward. But that is only part of the picture. Belarus is also described as a, quote, balcony from which Russia can project power across the European theater. It gives Moscow forward positions opposite Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. In wartime, Russian forces could advance from Belarus and the Kaliningrad region toward the roughly 65-kilometer Suwałki Gap, the Baltic states' only land connection with the rest of NATO. Belarus also provides a favorable position for an advance toward Moscow, and as recent years have shown, its territory can be used to attack Ukraine. The Belarusian-Ukrainian border stretches for around 1,084 kilometers, while Kyiv lies barely 100 kilometers from it. At the same time, the vast Pinsk marshes sharply restrict the number of viable invasion routes. The distinctive geography of Polessia, including the Minsk marshes, played an important role in the failure of Russia's attempt to seize the Ukrainian capital in the opening days of the war. Belarus is valuable to the Kremlin not only as a corridor for Russian troops, but also as an operational rear base. Belarusian roads, depots, repair facilities, hospitals and airfields supported units fighting near Kyiv and Chernihiv. Airfields in Homel, Ziabrovka, Maciulishi, Baranovichi and the Mozyr region were used for air operations, missile strikes, repairs and transport. The Mozyr refinery also supplied fuel to the Russian military. Even after Russia's defeat near Kyiv and the withdrawal of its forces from northern Ukraine, Belarusian territory has continued to play an important role in the war as a training, maintenance and industrial base. Russian soldiers have trained at Russian ranges, while local plants manufacture and repair equipment for Russia's war machine. According to estimates by the opposition group Belpol, by early 2025, at least 287 Belarusian state-owned enterprises were involved in producing weapons, ammunition, or components for Russia. Belarusian refineries also serve as a fuel reserve for European Russia whenever Ukrainian strikes disrupt Russian facilities. Another benefit of controlling Belarus is that it permanently ties down Ukrainian forces. Although, as already noted, there are few good routes for launching an attack across the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, the sheer fact that the frontier stretches for over 1,000 kilometers means that every troop concentration, military exercise, or alarmist statement by Lukashenko forces Kyiv to maintain reconnaissance, assets, fortifications, air defenses, and reserves in the north, forces that might otherwise be deployed to the Donbas. The threat from Belarus was particularly acute in late 2022 and early 2023, when Minsk and Moscow formed the regional grouping of forces and promoted the prospect of another advance on Kyiv. Today, only around 2,000 Russian soldiers are stationed in Belarus. That is a relatively small number, but Russia controls an extensive military infrastructure there that could be used to deploy much larger forces at short notice. Belarus also hosts a number of facilities supporting Russian operations in Ukraine. One example was the network of 4 relay stations operational until June this year that helped guide Russian drones, a subject to which we will return. The clearest symbol of Russia's growing military presence in Belarus is the incorporation of Belarusian territory into Moscow's nuclear deterrence system. In 2022, provisions on nuclear neutrality were removed from the Belarusian constitution. A year later, Moscow announced that Belarus had been placed under Russia's nuclear umbrella and that tactical nuclear weapons would be stationed on its territory. The precise number and storage location of these warheads have not been made public, although upgraded security at the depot near Osipovichi suggests that nuclear infrastructure may have been prepared there. The next step came in late 2025 with the reported deployment of Russian Oryeshnik systems at the Kirichev 6 base. The Oryeshnik is a mobile intermediate-range ballistic missile capable of carrying either conventional or nuclear warheads and striking targets across Europe. Its deployment does not fundamentally expand Russia's range. Moscow could already hit European capitals from Russian territory, but basing the system in Belarus reduces flight times, creates additional potential avenues of attack, and makes it harder for NATO to identify the launch site. It also carries political significance for the Kremlin. The presence of strategic infrastructure gives Russia another justification for maintaining a permanent military presence in Belarus and intervening in the event of a succession crisis. There are, however, doubts over whether either the nuclear warheads or the Oryeshnik systems have actually been deployed. So far, the evidence rests largely on Russian and Belarusian declarations, while open-source analysts have been considerably more cautious. Since Belarus already supports Russia's aggression against Ukraine by providing its territory, infrastructure and industrial capacity, an obvious question follows. Will Belarus formally enter the war? The formal deployment of Belarusian troops to Ukraine remains unlikely. Although Minsk is now better prepared institutionally for such a step than it was in February 2022, the Belarusian armed forces currently have around 48,000 active duty personnel, while the nominal mobilization reserve stands at 290,000. According to data compiled by the opposition National Anti-Crisis Management, the number of contract soldiers has risen by roughly 50% since 2022. Belarus has introduced call-up notices by text message, expanded its territorial defense forces, began establishing a Southern Operational Command, and intensified the training of reservists. The military has also received S-400 air defense systems, Iskander-M missiles, and additional Su-30 fighters, while mechanized brigades are creating dedicated attack drone companies. Behind these figures, however, lie serious limitations. Belarus has 4 mechanized brigades, each consisting of 5 battalions, but in peacetime they operate at only 30 to 40% of their authorized strength. Before any major operation, they would have to be reinforced with reservists. The best prepared component consists of around 6,000 special operation troops. The 37th Air Assault Brigade, currently being formed in the Homel region, is expected to number around 2,000 personnel, but its infrastructure is still incomplete. The military has learned to use drones, electronic warfare and small assault groups, but it lacks combat experience and the ability to conduct independent long-range strikes. Were Belarusian forces to enter the war, they would have to operate as the part of larger Russian formations. That in turn would require Moscow to deploy thousands of Russian troops to Belarus, something the Kremlin simply cannot afford at present. Moreover, since 2022, Ukraine has heavily mined and fortified terrain that was already extremely difficult to operate across, further undermining the military logic of a Belarusian offensive. The political calculation is equally important for Lukashenko. Independent polling shows that 85% of Belarusians oppose sending the army into Ukraine, while more than half are critical even of Russian missile and drone attacks launched from Belarusian territory. Repression has reduced the likelihood of mass protests, but mobilization and battlefield losses could lead to draft evasion, refusals to obey orders, and fractures within the security apparatus. Lukashenko will therefore do everything he can to sabotage any attempt to bring Belarus directly into the war. Especially now, because Kyiv has a credible capacity to retaliate. Ukraine's unmanned system forces have reportedly identified 500 potential targets in Belarus, including airfields, depots, arms factories, Russian military installations, and the refineries in Mozyr and Novopolotsk. Formal entry into the war would therefore transform Russia's previously safe rear area into a target zone for Ukrainian strikes, while forcing Moscow to divert scarce air defense systems to protect it. The shift in Ukraine's calculations is also visible in its approach to the Belarusian opposition. Until the end of 2025, Kyiv kept Swiatłana Tsikhanouska at arm's length. It regarded contacts with Belarusian exile structures as of limited practical value and at the same time as a potential provocation toward Lukashenko, whom Ukraine was still trying to deter from becoming more deeply involved in the war. On January 25, 2026, however, Zelensky met Tsikhanouska officially for the first time in Vilnius at Ukraine's initiative and later received her in Kyiv. He also announced the appointment of a special representative for Belarusian Democratic Forces. Over the following months, Ukraine imposed 2 rounds of sanctions on Lukashenko and his inner circle, while Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha announced the creation of a distinct, systematic policy toward Belarus. This shift shows that Kyiv no longer bases its actions on Lukashenko's goodwill. Belarus already functions as a rear base for Russia in any case. Kyiv appears to have concluded that Belarus's formal entry into the war could paradoxically benefit Ukraine by opening Russian targets on Belarusian territory to Ukrainian strikes. The rapprochement with Tsikhanouska is also a response to the thaw between Washington and Minsk. Kyiv is trying to obstruct Lukashenko's rehabilitation and is beginning to view democratic change in Belarus as a guarantee of its own long-term security. Although recent weeks have brought numerous reports of Vladimir Putin pressuring Lukashenko to join the war, this does not necessarily mean demands for Belarusian brigades to march on Kyiv. Some analysts argue that Russian pressure may instead concern hybrid operations against Poland and the Baltic states, particularly around the Suwałki Gap. The most likely scenarios therefore involve Belarus deepening its role in the confrontation with Ukraine and NATO without sending its troops to the front. To complete the picture of Belarus as Russia's rear base, it is worth looking at the economic dimension as well. Belarus's role in supporting Russia's war brought in orders that softened the impact of Western sanctions. After GDP fell by 4.7% in 2022, the economy grew by over 4% in 2023 and 2024. Russia opened its market to Belarusian goods, gave Belarus access to its ports, and continued supplying oil and gas on preferential terms. The withdrawal of Western companies also created space for Belarusian manufacturers of trucks, tractors, machinery, and food products. The rebound, however, proved short-lived. In 2025, GDP growth slowed to just 1%. Belarus began to feel the effects of weaker Russian demand, high interest rates in Russia, and saturation in a market where Russian competitors had re-emerged. The problem is compounded by the concentration of Belarusian exports. Before 2020, Russia accounted for around 42 to 45% of Belarusian foreign sales. Today the figure is above 65%, and in some sectors more than 90%. As a result, any shift in the Russian market is felt acutely by Belarusian companies. One example is Yangpur, an oil company owned by Belarusneft. After posting a profit of $35 million in 2024, it recorded an $18 million loss the following year and declared bankruptcy. Another is the Minsk automobile plant, whose truck sales in Russia fell by 43% last year. Minsk has responded by cutting prices. Belarusian goods are sometimes sold more cheaply in Russia than at home, all to keep factories running and preserve jobs. Lukashenko himself admitted that the same Belarusian cement was being sold on the Russian market for 40% less. Such dumping may help fulfill production targets and prevent plant closures, but it erodes profitability and increases companies' dependence on credit. The war has therefore reinforced the old features of Lukashenko's economic model: administrative price controls, state-directed lending to selected industries, and the subordination of economic logic to political stability. Belarus's deepening economic and political dependence on Russia makes the opening of a direct channel with the United States enormously valuable to Lukashenko. That channel is managed by John Cole, the US President's special envoy for Belarus. The mechanism is remarkably simple. Minsk releases successive groups of political prisoners, and Washington lifts successive sanctions in return. So far, around 500 people have been freed, while the United States has removed sanctions on Belarusian potash producers and eased restrictions on Belavia and the banking sector. Cole has said that Washington is prepared to lift all sanctions on Minsk that are unrelated to the war in Ukraine. Also under discussion are the return of a Minsk ambassador to Minsk for the first time in 18 years, and even a visit by Lukashenko to the White House. But what is Washington trying to achieve? Certainly not democratization. No one is presenting Lukashenko with such conditions. The minimum objective appears to be the release of Belarusian opposition figures and an end to Belarusian hybrid operations against Poland and the Baltic states. Some media reports suggest that Washington wants also to increase Belarusian autonomy and help Lukashenko counter Russian influence. But that appears too ambitious to be treated seriously by anyone in the US capital. A more plausible interpretation, advanced by some analysts, is that Belarus serves as a testing ground for US-Russian negotiations. The Trump administration may primarily want to show Putin what he could expect if American mediation over the war in Ukraine eventually produced a peace agreement. It is worth noting that the American channel operates with the Kremlin's explicit approval, and Lukashenko regularly briefs Putin on the course of his talks with the United States. There are, however, signs that he is also pursuing his own interests. In November last year, at Washington's request, he released 31 Ukrainian prisoners, including people who had acted against Russian military facilities in Belarus. It is difficult to believe that Moscow welcomed that decision. In any case, the American channel has important limitations. The talks are being conducted without coordination with the European Union. Yet it is Brussels that controls access to SWIFT. EU sanctions affect around 70% of Belarusian exports, and without restoring transit through Klaipeda, reopening Belarusian potash exports would achieve little. One could therefore argue that the United States is giving Lukashenko a chance to revive his old, quote, game of appearances, but only at a limited scale. Baćka's room for maneuver is incomparably smaller than it was before 2020. Contacts with Trump may improve his negotiating position, but they do not provide an alternative to the Russian market or Russia's security system. This brings us to the final question of today's episode. What future awaits Belarus and Lukashenko himself? Is Russian annexation genuinely a realistic possibility? Although the formal absorption of Belarus cannot be ruled out, Moscow has little need for it today. Russia already uses Belarusian territory freely as an operational rear base, while Minsk remains politically and economically dependent on Moscow. Lukashenko, meanwhile, bears responsibility for maintaining domestic stability, an agreement that suits the Kremlin perfectly. Under current conditions, annexation would bring costs without meaningful benefits. Russia would not only have to contend with resistance from Belarusian society. Were annexation to take place before the end of the war in Ukraine, Kyiv would almost certainly try to exploit the situation by destabilizing Belarus and encouraging an anti-Russian uprising. A formally sovereign Belarus is simply a more convenient instrument than 6 new regions of the Russian Federation. More decisive developments may come only if the Kremlin manages to end the war in Ukraine on favorable terms or if Lukashenko dies. Baćka was born in 1954 and will turn 72 in August. Despite ruling since 1994, He has never designated a successor and has systematically eliminated anyone who might threaten his position. Lukashenko has recently strengthened the All-Belarusian People's Assembly, but he appears to be preparing it less for a succession crisis after his death than as an institution through which could continue ruling from behind the scenes if he chose not to seek another presidential term. Even if Lukashenko tried to appoint a successor and secure a controlled transfer of power, there would still be a risk that the Kremlin, if it regarded the chosen candidate as contrary to its interests, would invoke the provisions on defending Belarus's, quote, constitutional order. When considering the succession question, it is worth remembering that Putin himself is 2 years older than Lukashenko. If the old State Farm director were to outlive the old KGB officer, he might gain not only the chance to choose his own successor in Minsk, but perhaps also an opportunity to loosen the Russian grip on Belarus. For now, the most likely scenario is a continuation of the current trajectory, creeping annexation. Integration between Russia and Belarus will probably deepen, but formal annexation still appears distant. From the Kremlin's perspective, it is far more useful to preserve Belarus as a formally separate state. That allows Moscow to use it as a, quote, gray zone, not only in its confrontation with Ukraine, but also in its confrontation with NATO. More decisive developments are likely only after the war in Ukraine has been resolved, or after the death of Lukashenko or Putin. For now, Belarus remains independent on the map, but whether it survives as a sovereign state may ultimately depend on which of the two aging autocrats dies first.